The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is your host, David Hendrickson, with co-host
Dan Riveros.
And we are actually in our offices here at Giving Company headquarters in Alpharetta, Georgia.
I can't believe it.
Dan, I'm looking at you face to face, man. You look good.
Wow.
He's pretty clean shaven. I got a haircut, so we're not doing too bad.
Yeah, I bowled it out and went outside finally. It was looking rough.
Yeah, well, you look good, Dan, and it's good to just see you in person. And our guest today, Good Samaritans, Dan, literally, I'm putting him in my top 5 all time.
Woo!
I mean, seriously, team. So we have so much to talk about today with our guest because some of his stories are, we've turned them ridiculous in a good way. I mean, they are unbelievable. And to be very candid, if we want to highlight a stories or a journey that really does parallel the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is what this podcast is all about. Our guest today is right there in the middle of it.
Ray Norman.
Without further ado, Dr. Ray Norman, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thank you, Dave and Dan. It's good to be with you.
You are sequestered in Pennsylvania.
I am.
But you sound good. You sound good. Hey, Dan, you know, I'd like to think that the SEC has sort of a corner on the market of Good Samaritans because Philip Langford from International Justice Mission is an Auburn grad. Guess who else is an Auburn grad?
Tell me.
Ray Norman. Ray Norman. Me being a Georgia fan, it's a little hard to admit, but I'd like to do a plug for the SEC, maybe.
There you go.
Well, we'll forgive you for being a Georgia fan.
Well, Ray, I am going to tell our listeners more about you, if you don't mind. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to go through your bio here, and I think them like us will be, you know, really amazed at the kind of work that you have done over the course of your professional career. So Dan and Ray, bear with me. I'm going to introduce our listeners to Dr. Ray Norman, and then we are going to get into what is going to be an incredible discussion. Dr. Ray Norman was raised in rural West Africa, the son of medical missionaries. He has spent more than 20 years leading and managing water, agriculture, and poverty reduction programs in developing regions. His early career work spanned over 15 years in Africa and the Middle East as a researcher and development specialist in the water and agricultural sectors, serving with Cornell University in Niger, Winrock International in Niger, Sultan Qaboos University in Oman, and the African Development Bank in both Egypt and Cote d'Ivoire. In 1999, he joined World Vision International as the national director in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. And there's an incredible story about Ray Norman's time in Mauritania that we're going to get into. He later served as Dean of the School of Science, Engineering, and Health at Messiah College for 12 years, while continuing to intersect with World Vision in an advisory and consulting capacity. Over the years, he has also worked as a consultant to the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and various other international NGOs, largely as an agriculture and water management specialist. He returned to World Vision in 2015 in a full-time role as the Director for Faith Leadership for their water, sanitation, and hygiene, what we call WASH, programs. In 2018, he was appointed as Senior Director for WASH, WVI Global Field Operations, and today serves as the WASH Global Sector Lead. Ray represents World Vision frequently at conferences, symposia, workshops, and donor events, and is a member of the WVUS Speakers Bureau. He is author of some 50 over 50 technical and research publications in water, agriculture, and faith integration disciplines. His book, Dangerous Love, published by Thomas Nelson HarperCollins, chronicles the true story of the attempt on the lives of him and his daughter by a gunman in Mauritania in the aftermath of 9/11. The story in part articulates World Vision's approach to fulfilling its Christ-centered mission in Muslim environments, unpacks Norman's spiritual and emotional journey of reconciliation and forgiveness, and recounts the outpouring of love they received from their Muslim friends and World Vision colleagues in a time of deep personal tragedy. Here it comes. Ray holds a Bachelor of Science from Auburn University, a Master of Science and PhD in Agriculture and Biological Engineering from Cornell University, and also maintains an appointment as a scholar in residence at Messiah College in the U.S. Okay, Ray, I got to get the pronunciation correct. Your wife's name?
Helen.
Ray is married to Helen and has 2 adult children, Nathaniel and Hannah. Ray and his wife are members of Living Water Community Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, an inner-city multi-ethnic church that works to bring justice and hope to the urban communities that it serves. How about that, Dan?
Wow. David, take a break.
I feel like we should go back to work, man.
Wow.
We got a lot to do.
Jeez.
Hey, Ray, it is really great to have you. We are so thankful that you are here. Hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to go off script for a second.
Sure.
Right at the beginning. You're probably like, why did we even, put a script together?
No, that's
How is Living Water Community Church doing amongst the racial challenges and tension and tragedy that we've experienced over the past several weeks here in the U.S.?
And follow that up with also mentioning how COVID has affected all of this.
Wow. Well, Living Water Community was actually founded by several families that were multiracial and, has looked to establish a safe haven and a real Christian community that's truly multi-ethnic and truly reflects the community where it's planted. And so we have about, it's about, 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Latino, and everything in between. But this, COVID, of course, has been very challenging for us to be able to meet. We've gone virtual until just this last weekend when we met outside. But the issues around race that have recently come up with all the events in the U.S. have been enormously challenging. And the pastoral team has had to address the issue of, how do we put our frustration and anger in check, and how do we really represent Christ in the midst of this? How do we be salt and light in the midst of a really, really challenging time? Our pastor got up just this last weekend when we met finally outside, socially distanced, and just wept. Over the challenge. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity. There's a lot of good that's happening. There's some also very challenging and upsetting things. But in the midst of this, our prayer, and that's Living Water's prayer, is that we can leverage this for Christ's purposes and make this a more just and wholesome place for everyone.
Yeah. Do you have one? So let me preface this question with a statement, and you can agree or disagree. My observation, despite some of the things that I've observed on Twitter, mostly Twitter, less Facebook, is that the evangelical community, regardless of race, has stepped up in a more meaningful way over the past few weeks in the area of racial reconciliation and systemic racial injustice than they have in the past. If you agree with that statement, can you maybe explain why that might be?
Well, that's a tough question. I think you're correct, and I do agree with you. We have stepped up, but I think it's somewhat to our shame that we had to wait until
I think that's fair.
An incident like this to do this. Why were we not out leading this and being a voice for this issue that's been around for so long? Because I've just seen the evangelical church miss out so often. Where was the white evangelical church during the civil rights movement. We came in far too late on that.
Right.
You can move on to these other opportunities. After 9/11, the rhetoric of hate and disdain that came out from many leaders regarding Muslims, rather than seizing that as an opportunity to love them and welcome them when many were questioning their own faith. So I just think I wish that we would be more forward thinking. But
that's good.
If it takes a crisis like this to wake us up, then thank God, maybe we will rise to the occasion.
Well, that's well said, and I would definitely agree. We had a lot of room to grow, right? We had a lot of opportunity to improve over our past behaviors. So I think that's very well said.
So, Ray, with so much to cover, why don't we just start at the beginning? What was it like growing up in rural West Africa?
Well, it was a wonderful experience. I have no regrets for that, although some people think I should. I'll always remember when we were home, we would come home once every 4 years, so we didn't get back to the U.S. very often, but we were home and my parents were speaking in churches. And I remember I was dutifully standing in line after the service with my parents so that people could come and shake the missionaries' hands. And people would come and, shake my parents' hands and pat me on the head and then, move on. And I remember this elderly lady came up to me and patted me on the head and said, "Oh, you poor thing, you poor child, you have to live and grow up in Africa, and you don't get to grow up in your own country." And I remember thinking, lady, you have no idea. I am the most fortunate kid in the world. I've got the African jungle as my backyard. I've got all the adventures before me that other kids don't have. So I loved it. But the most important thing, I think, for me was having the opportunity to watch my father, who was a medical doctor, and my mother live a life of service for Christ for other people. And that had a profound impact on me, watching them live out their lives in these very remote locations, loving people with a genuine heart and being the love of Christ and his hand extended. And as a child, that just profoundly impacted me and had an indelible impression.
That's awesome. So how'd you get from West Africa to Auburn?
Well, my parents met in Auburn.
Really? This is just going back too far.
My parents were members of the BSU, the Baptist Student Union.
There you go.
Met there. And actually, though, that's not the reason I went to Auburn. I was looking for to study science, and actually the program I was looking for, Auburn had one of the best programs in agricultural engineering, so that's why I chose it.
Wow. Well, I always, I worry a little bit about the Auburn grads because they seem to get confused between what's an eagle and what's a tiger. But, you seem to have moved beyond that in your academic pursuits. So,
well, let me just say one other thing. This is going to shock everyone. I do hold a record at Auburn. I think I'm the only Auburn graduate who has never been to an Auburn football game.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Because Saturdays during the games, that was the best time to study. The library was always empty.
There you go.
And I would head to the library. So I've never been to an Auburn football game.
Well, we can probably fix that if you have an aspiration. One of our board members is crazy Auburn. I mean, we can't shake it here. It's just unbelievable, the number of Auburn people that we know. But let's talk a little bit more about your academic pursuits. You are clearly serious about your academics. I love, that you have a PhD in the sciences, Ray. Sometimes evangelicals get accused of ignoring science or not thinking scientifically or using the scientific method. And here you are with a PhD from Cornell and two other degrees, a bachelor's and a master's in these engineering disciplines. I was a chemistry major in college. Something tells me that I was not the stellar student that you were, because I didn't quite spend my Saturdays the same way that you did. But talk about what got you. You mentioned Auburn had one of the best programs in the areas that you were interested in. We're not surprised to encounter water engineers, agricultural engineers, because of our relationship with World Vision. But what got you so interested in that discipline?
Well, as I said, my parents had a profound effect on me, and I was interested in following their footsteps. My parents never pushed me to do that, but as I grew in my own Christian faith, I really wanted to serve in regions beyond. But I was more interested in being able to live out my life in places where most Christians don't have access to. There's a lot of the world that's very difficult for Christians to live and to work in and to live out their faith and calling. And I wanted to have something in hand that could get me into some of these more difficult and challenging places. And so, much of the Muslim world in the Middle East and much of Africa and North Africa is desert country. And I realized that working in the area of water could perhaps give me opportunities that I would otherwise not have. I started out wanting to do theological studies. In fact, I visited several seminaries before I went to graduate school, and that was, I thought that's what a lot of people do. If you want to be a missionary, you get a theological degree and you do that and go abroad. But I discovered as a child that what keeps parents awake at night in these poor countries is not the condition of their souls. It's the wailing of their hungry children. And I thought, if you really want to get into people's hearts, you've got to, as Jesus did, you've got to meet people's physical needs. And so I thought that perhaps through using water and that discipline of study would give me access, and it has. It's proved to be just a wonderful opportunity. Yeah. So that was my motivation for studying water engineering.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the WASH program at World Vision, if you don't mind. And I know Giving Company plays just a small part of the work that you all do around the world providing clean water. We've been a partner to World Vision WASH since about July of 2015. And for any of our listeners that are part of our subscription program, what we now call the Giving Membership, you've been a part of contributing a little bit over $300,000, about $320,000 total to World Vision WASH. And Ray, the calculation that we use, I think with some input from World Vision, is that $50 can give somebody the gift of clean water for life. Dan, you and I were in Ethiopia. We're going to talk more about that in a minute to see some of the successful water programs. It's amazing how a community can be transformed from having to survive with dirty water sources to having access to clean water. So Ray, it's really a privilege for us to be a small part of this. Can you talk about the global water program that you're a part of overseeing and why it's so transformational in communities?
Yeah, thanks, David, for this opportunity. First of all, let me say thank you for being a partner to World Vision for our WASH, our water, sanitation, hygiene programs. It's wonderful to have partners such as yourself and your group. We take here in the West and certainly in the U.S., we take water in our taps for granted, just like we take our toilets for granted. They're easily accessible. But in the world today, about 1 in 3 people, roughly about 2.2 billion people around the world, don't have safe drinking water. More than half of the global population, which is about 4.2 billion people, don't have safe sanitation facilities. And we often think, well, it's because they don't bother. But, when you're living on $2 a day, to get safe sanitation in your home, it represents about 10 to 15% of your annual income. And would you or I spend 10 to 15% of our annual income on a toilet? About 3 billion people around the world lack basic hand washing facilities at home. And of course, that has really come to light with the COVID crisis. And we're really trying to surge forward on providing hand washing facilities in communities and in homes and in healthcare facilities. But the real issue is that an estimated 360,000 deaths per year of children under the age of 5 mostly in low-income countries, are attributable to unsafe water and hygiene. And that doesn't include the adults or anyone over 5. That's just children under 5. And of course, most of this is because of diarrheal diseases that come through, waterborne, through waterborne sources.
That's 1,000 kids a day, right?
Mm.
That's the way the math works, right?
Exactly. And, we talk about the crisis of COVID, which is serious, but we've had this ongoing crisis of lack of safe water that takes a much more significant toll. And the issue of providing clean water, it bleeds out into other areas. For example, we know that there is a serious problem in developing countries with child malnutrition. And the lack of clean water is a huge cause of that. About 50% of child malnutrition is associated with unsafe water. When children have chronic diarrhea, no matter how much good food they get, their bodies don't absorb the nutrition. So providing clean water completely transforms communities, and it leverages opportunities to eradicate malnutrition. It boosts livelihoods and agriculture. It has all these other positive effects. So in World Vision, we're very, very grateful to have this opportunity. Let me just also throw in that God has blessed World Vision beyond our wildest dreams in terms of being able to serve in this area. When we started our water programs 25 or 30 years ago, we never dreamed where we'd be today. Today, we have the opportunity of reaching one new person with water every 10 seconds. We're one of the largest providers of clean water in the world. Last year, we provided clean water to 3.4 million people. And about 2.5 million people with household sanitation. So I just feel deeply privileged, to serve with World Vision in this capacity. And I'm so glad that a Christian organization is out leading the front on this.
Yeah. I've been to two sort of water vision trips with World Vision, one to Honduras with Johnny Lopez and Terry Johnson and Amy Thompson and a number of folks from World Vision, Ray. And Dan and I went to Ethiopia together. Both of those trips started out with a visit to a community without access to clean water. Dan, do you remember our trip sort of under that bridge to that river? Yeah. And what were your impressions when you saw that, when we first got to Ethiopia?
My first impression was just, wow, this is awful. And then later in the afternoon when we went and saw a community that did have water, it was just night and day. The difference that the work is making over there. It just, wow. That's really the only thing to say.
And a big impact, Ray, on women, right? It's women not having to make the trip twice a day, average of 6 kilometers each way. Yeah. Girls being able to go to school, so they don't have to help mom. I mean, there's a big women empowerment story to WASH.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Both for women who are at home as homemakers, as well as young girls who are often, free, as you said, freed up to get an education because they don't have to be looking for water all day.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna transition from WASH, and maybe we'll come back at the end, Ray, and ask you maybe to talk to our listeners about how they might get involved with some of the global WASH initiatives sponsored by World Vision. But I do want to say this with all sincerity, because I know we've had a lot of fun getting to know each other in the weeks leading up to this podcast. But World Vision and your book, Dangerous Love, and your leadership of kind of interfaith initiatives at World Vision really were a major inspiration for this podcast. And Dan, I want to dial back the clock to 2 years ago. I think it was April of 2018. You and I I think we go to Dulles, and then we went from Dulles to Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And we spend, I think, the first day seeing, some water projects, and then we get on a plane to Mekelle in northern Ethiopia, and you get selected to sort of participate in the Ethiopian ceremony of cutting the bread. And Ray, you may have to interject here a little bit on the meaning of the ceremony. But here's Dan, my colleague, and he's cutting bread with an evangelical Christian leader, religious leader in northern Ethiopia, and a Muslim leader in northern Ethiopia, and they're all grasping hands, and they've got their hands on the bread knife, and they're participating in this ceremony, and I can't even breathe. I mean, I am at a loss for words. And before we talk to Ray, Dan, about the organization of these interfaith councils and the work that they've done, and we're going to lead sort of in and out of the Mauritania story in a second. What was going through your mind as you grabbed the bread knife with a Muslim leader and an evangelical leader and participate in this ritual ceremony in Ethiopia? Were you as blown away as I was at that moment?
Yeah, I thought it was cool. I mean, I didn't grow up in a church or anything like that. So my big exposure to Christianity really came when I started working here. So when I got over there and just saw like the impact of work, that it was like, wow, we're working with everybody in the community as not just Christian leaders. It was really cool to see. I wasn't really sure what we were going to step into, you know?
Yeah.
I had gone to Guatemala through the company a couple years before, but I was around nothing but Christian people there. This was the first trip where I was like, wow, like it's bigger. It's like just help.
Yeah.
It really is just help.
Yeah.
So that was what was going through my brain, just kind of wow.
So we're sitting in a relatively small room.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think they had split the crowd, Ray. So I think there were three Christian leaders and three Muslim leaders, and then the World Vision staff and the Giving Company staff all in this room. And here's some of the stories that we heard. The religious leaders decided that they needed to get together for child advocacy, for violence reduction, and for preservation of families and marriages. So they said, hey, if religious leaders can't sort of look across the aisle, but that's sort of a political comment. That's not right. But across the chasm of separation of the two largest world religions for the sake of children, like that should be a guiding principle that would cause us to do that. But then we hear that they go to one another's birthday parties, and that there's Christians helping build mosques, and that there's Muslims helping build Sunday schools, and that they get together on a social basis as well as within the Interfaith Council. And then I hear, this was the part that really got me. One of the Muslim leaders, and it was a female, and she was telling me how thrilled she was that her son was going to the state university, the state-sponsored university in Ethiopia. And as Ray now knows, both of my kids go to the state-sponsored university here in Georgia, the University of Georgia. And all of a sudden, it clicks that I now have something incredibly meaningful in common with this Muslim leader in Ethiopia, which is our children are blessed to take the next step in their education because they're being supported to go to the state university where we live. And Ray, like I literally can't even gather myself at this point, because we just don't hear about these kinds of things. Maybe they exist in the United States, but I don't hear about them much. Dan, I don't know if you hear about them much. We did a follow-up video, and I think both Dan and I highlighted the Interfaith Council as one of the most moving experiences that we had in life, let alone this trip to Ethiopia with World Vision. So huge intro, Ray, but if you could talk about how these interfaith councils came together and the kind of impact that you're seeing and sort of your specific leadership roles with these interfaith councils that are sponsored by World Vision.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for that wonderful story of your experience in Ethiopia with the Interfaith Forum. Yeah, this is there's a lot to talk about here, and I will try to keep this brief. But World Vision first started looking at this interfaith work back during, with the HIV crisis. Because, people were being stigmatized. There was a lot of misunderstanding. And, in the kind of work that World Vision does, and we work closely with governments as well, when you go into a remote community, people will not always trust an outsider like a World Vision agent when they come to talk to them, for example, about HIV, much less a government agent. And, we realize that faith leaders, whether pastors, priests, or imams, they are some of the most trusted leaders in these communities. Communities listen in general to their faith leaders.
Yeah.
So World Vision started looking for ways to pull these faith leaders together, to sit at the table together, because they were not sitting at the table. To sit at the table and find common ground. Of course, the common ground are the needs of the community. And when you put these people together, all of a sudden they discover that they've got a lot more in common than just their differences.
Yeah.
So World Vision, across the world now, in all communities, we work to bring faith leaders together. We provide training for them. If it's in child protection, we do that. If it's in water, sanitation, and hygiene, we train them on the basics of clean water and good hygiene, and we mobilize them as advocates for the work we do. And that has really served to advance a lot of the work we do in various communities. And let me just go back. I was at an interfaith forum meeting myself not too long back in Ethiopia. And I remember there was an Orthodox priest, an evangelical pastor, and an imam there, among some others. And they were explaining what the Interfaith Council was doing, some of the initiatives they were doing in the community together. And it was, just, as you said, it was just absolutely wonderful. But, I always want to be sure this is really working the way it was. And after the meeting was over, we were standing around having a cup of tea. And I leaned over to the Orthodox priest, and I said, it's wonderful what you're doing here. I said, but is this really as wonderful as it sounds? Has it impacted you personally, this working with this interfaith forum? And he was an older man, and he said to me, Mr. Norman, for years in my church, I preached on loving your neighbor. Which is, a biblical theme. He said, but it wasn't until I joined this Interfaith Council, and as he said that, he reached over to the imam standing beside him and put his arm around him. And he said, it wasn't until I came to this Interfaith Council that I really learned how to love my neighbor.
Yeah.
And he said, this imam is my neighbor. He said, for years, I never regarded him as my neighbor, but he is my neighbor. So let me just add also that I think it's very important when we talk about this interfaith work and bringing faith leaders together that it does not mean, and this is World Vision has this view, it does not mean that we compromise our Christian faith. We do not water down our Christian identity in any way when we engage in this.
Yeah.
There are certain boundaries, and we don't get together in these interfaith councils and discuss theology. We talk about what we have in common, that is the needs of the community. And one of the rules that we use in World Vision, because it can be a sticky area, when you're engaged in interfaith work, what are the boundaries and contours of that? What's right? What's not right? And one of the basic rules we do is we ask ourselves in any interfaith initiative, we ask ourselves for the people who are not Christians in this group, does this type of activity that we're engaging in serve to lead people towards Christ or away from Christ? And I can't go into all these stories. There's stories that we'll never hear until the other side of heaven, but the opportunities for Christian witness, the opportunities for these faith leaders of other faiths to hear the gospel and to learn about Scripture is absolutely remarkable. It just opens up an enormous opportunity to share our faith in very appropriate and non-offensive ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna double down a little bit here, and again, you can reverse my declaration here, but help me get the percentages right here, Ray, but World Vision does its work. 25 or so % of the countries in which you do work are Muslim-dominated countries, something like that.
Yes, I think that's about right. With our water, sanitation, and hygiene, I was trying to crunch those numbers a couple of years ago. I think about closer to 60% of our work is done in other faith contexts, non-Christian majority context. Most of the world, most of the poor are communities of other faiths today.
And there's a similar percentage of sponsored children, World Vision sponsored children, that are of other faiths. And so here's sort of my declaration. Tell me if you think Luke would be disappointed in me from his parable of the Good Samaritan. To be a Good Samaritan in the context of the parable in Luke chapter 10, our listeners have heard this before. The reality that Jesus made the hero of the story a Samaritan. The priest walked by, the Levite walked by. There's a Jewish person who's been beaten and left for dead on the other side of the road. It's been equated to gang violence, right? Like the difference between the Jews and Samaritans might be the Bloods and the Crips. It might be the Muslims and the Serbs in Bosnia. It might be the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. Like it was that significant between Jews and Samaritans at that time. And so I would almost say that World Vision has taught us that if you really want to be a good Samaritan, this idea of being able to engage with people of other faiths is almost a basic requirement.
I think we're learning that. We have learned that. It's taken a long time, and even in World Vision, it took us a long time. But yes, I would say so.
There you go, Danny. How about that for me and Luke, right? Nice. All right, so we're going to ratchet up the amazement here, Ray, and we're going to move to Mauritania. Before we talk about the story that inspired the book Dangerous Love, can you tell our listeners just a little bit about what you were doing in Mauritania?
Mauritania is an Islamic republic. It's kind of at the end of nowhere. It's at the western end of the Sahara Desert. It's a little known country, which is 90% desert. The rest of it is rocky, barren mountains. World Vision has had a program there since the 1980s. It's one of the few countries that's a full Islamic republic where we operate fully and completely. But it is a country where open Christian witness is actually illegal. So many people think, well, why are you there? Why don't you shake the dust off your feet? But we have found in World Vision that you don't have to. There's other forms of witness other than verbal witness, and so I was there as the director of World Vision's program for several years, and a lot of our work was reflecting on how do we be a faithful Christian presence here, given the restrictions, and how do we quietly be a demonstration of Christ's love for all people. And God opened up incredible doors for us to do that. And we worked in a variety of poverty reduction initiatives. We also started a child sponsorship program that's still going today. And that program, yes, you've been there now some nearly 35 years.
That's awesome.
So not really sure the right way to ease into this question, but right after 9/11, you and your daughter were shot by a man with a 9mm pistol on the way to the beach. Could you describe that entire scenario for us?
Well, we were living in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, when 9/11 occurred. We were serving, several 100,000 of the poorest of the poor in the country. And then to our surprise, let me just qualify that. Somewhat to our surprise, 9/11 occurred. Of course, we knew, having lived in the Muslim world, that there was a lot of simmering discontent with the attitudes of the West. the openness, things, the types of films and the pornography and the loose lifestyles that are advocated are very offensive to Muslims. And, many Muslims just felt that the West was exporting their values across the world. So we understood some of the simmering frustration, but we never dreamed we'd see 9/11. When that happened, we had to go into shutdown for about 5 weeks. We were confined to our homes. The government provided guards at our offices and homes, and it was really a real touch and go because we thought we may have to be evacuated. There were a few pockets of sympathizers with the perpetuators of 9/11 in Mauritania, but the majority of people, majority of Muslims were horrified by those events. We had people, neighbors coming to our home, Muslims, in tears, asking us to forgive the acts of the perpetuators of 9/11, not to associate that with all Muslims.
Yeah.
So finally, after about 5 or 6 weeks, things eased up. The American embassy and the other embassies, French embassy, announced that we could begin to move around more freely. And we had been kind of confined for several weeks. And my wife, who is French, had traveled to France to take care of her parents. My son was off in boarding school, and I was alone with my 10-year-old daughter. And so one of the few things you can do in Mauritania that's absolutely wonderful is to get out to the beach, because we had 400 kilometers of empty beach. And so we decided we would go out to the beach for the afternoon after work. And I took her out to a very isolated area outside of town where we usually would go. And I was stopped in the midst of the sand dunes trying to put my car into the hubs into four-wheel drive when an Arab man walked up. He was dressed in a turban and his flowing robe, and he came up and greeted us. He spoke impeccable Arabic and impeccable French, and we greeted each other, and I thought he wanted a ride into town, but I said to him, we're headed to the beach to enjoy an afternoon walk together. And then, to my utter surprise, he pulled out a 9mm pistol, didn't ask any questions. He took 3 shots at my temple. I was in the front seat of the car. My daughter was in the seat beside me, and he took 3 shots and put the pistol up against the window and fired 3 shots at my temple. And to my amazement, they misfired. And my daughter began screaming, so he took aim at her. And at that moment, I realized that there's no way I'm going to survive this. But if I can do anything to protect my daughter, I will. So I threw my arms up in my chest against the window. And the 4th shot that he took aim at my daughter with went off. And the bullet came through the window and through my arm. And, of course, all the glass exploded. And unknown to me at that time, I only learned it, a little time later when we were able to escape. With the chaos and the shattered glass, I was able to put the vehicle in drive, and he took out the back windows. I realized a few minutes later, when I turned to my daughter, that the bullet that had gone through my arm had hit her in the center of her chest. And when I looked at her, the seat was, filling with blood, and she was curled up in the seat. Fast forward, we were, World Vision was able to get us evacuated. They flew in a plane late that night, and my daughter was stabilized. I had a very bad wound in my arm, but I was going to be okay. But her situation was more precarious. We were medevaced that night and eventually taken to France, and she was put in the children's hospital there, and she survived. But that's basically what happened on the beach.
Oh,
Wow.
it's an unbelievable story, and it gets more unbelievable. And Ray, I know you didn't necessarily want us to plug the book, but the book Dangerous Love tells this story of your time in Mauritania, this tragedy, and then what happens later. And so we should tell our listeners your your daughter continued to heal. I think she's married now.
Yes.
So the story does end well, but the reaction of your family, which included your wife, and she had a sort of a confrontation. Confrontation isn't the right term, but she met with, the gunsman. Just try, if you can, to describe what your family did in light of your Christian faith in terms of forgiveness. And ultimately, I think, if I remember correctly from the book, you all kind of went to bat for the gunman to have an early release, and you have a relationship with his family.
Yeah, so I can give some of the briefly try to give some of the highlights, and then more details can be found in the book. But the first challenge was everyone was telling us to shut down our program in Mauritania because it was just too risky for us, and that we should not return. I remember our pastors back home all advised, our pastor friends in the U.S. and in France advised us to come home and to heal. But World Vision, as with any other Christian organization that works in these environments, we work with the most poor and the most vulnerable communities. And we come in there and make this promise that we have come to help you on your journey out of poverty. And that was a commitment we had made to these communities. And so we make this commitment to these vulnerable communities. But my question after we were shot and people were telling us to shut down the program was, what kind of Christian witness is this when all of a sudden we become vulnerable? Do we shut down our end of the deal? Do we pack up our bags and go home? And especially in a Muslim country, what kind of testimony would that be? So my wife and I, we really wrestled with this, and we decided that we needed to go back to Mauritania. So we did. But even once I got there, it was very tenuous. We had to go through several months of trying to decide, is it safe for our staff? And I remember I was really conflicted. I just, as I said, my own pastors, my own spiritual leaders were telling us to come home. Some people in the organization were saying you should shut down. Others were saying, well, you can try to hold out. And I remember I just didn't know where to turn, and an idea came to me. I thought, well, maybe I could get in touch with one of the leaders, the Islamic leaders. And so I contacted the leading imam, the leading Muslim cleric of the country.
Yeah, the guy. You went to the very top, right?
Yes, and I asked if I could have an audience with him, thinking that I probably would not be granted that. And to my utter surprise, 3 days later, he came to my office, sitting there, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And this was a very old, aged imam with his big turban and white beard. And I said, "Sir, I'm just conflicted. World Vision has come here, has been working here for 17 years among the most vulnerable communities. You know the incident that happened after 9/11 to my daughter and myself." And I said, many of my people are telling me to come home, and my own spiritual leaders are saying come home. And I said, what do you advise? And he looked at me and said, "Mr. Norman, I think there's three things you need to understand." He said, the first is, World Vision is a very professional organization, and I commend you for the quality work that you do in our poor communities. Number two, you bring a sense of order to these poor communities, and I commend you for that. And then he shook his finger at me and he said, "But there's a third thing, Mr. Norman, that I don't think you understand." Now remember, all before this, we were always praying, "Lord, we cannot be an open witness here, but are we demonstrating your love to this country?" And he said, "Mr. Norman, the third thing is that you don't realize is that in Islam, we work with the poor because we're obliged to. We are commanded to give alms to the poor." He said, "But you people at World Vision, you Christians, you work with the poor because you love the poor.
Yeah.
If for no other reason, stay in this country and teach our people how to love their poor."
And there's your answer.
I got on the phone and called the International World Vision president, and I said, God just spoke to me today through the voice of an imam, and we're going to keep the program going. You know, and then fast forward, we were able to visit the prisoner. My wife was insistent. We heard that he would probably, before his case came to trial, he would probably be quietly disposed of. And my wife said, we can't let that happen. We've got to go visit him and encourage him.
And she gives him a Bible, I think, right?
Well, the first thing she did was, you're not allowed to pass out Bibles. You're not even supposed to have a Bible in that.
That's right. That's right.
She had a Bible, and I made her take it out of her bag. Unknown to me, she slipped it back in before we went into the prison.
It's a great part of the book. I love it.
But we got into the prison, and I didn't know what she was going to do. And she's this very small, petite French lady, and she looked at the prisoner and she said, "Sir, Mr. Ali, do you remember after you shot my daughter and son and husband? Do you remember that the papers said that told about how you fired 3 shots at his head?" And the paper said that God surely must have been protecting my husband. And he said, "Yes, I did read those articles." And he said, "Perhaps it's true. Perhaps Allah was protecting your husband. I don't know." And my wife looked at him and she said, "Mr. Ali, I think you got it wrong here." She said, "I think the papers got it wrong." Yes, God cares about my husband, and perhaps in some measure he protected him. But I think God was protecting you. Because while my husband's life is important, your life is just as important to God as my husband's. Because had you succeeded in killing him, imagine where you would be today. And of course, this opened up an incredible opportunity. Then she walked across the prison yard. She was told not to approach the man. She went up and sat down beside him, pulled out her Bible, started in Romans, and just shared the gospel with him. And so we were able to assist him to eventually get released from prison and to be reinserted back into society. And we established a relationship with his family as well. And
I feel like we got to put Ray's wife in the top 5 as well, Dan, after this story.
Next day, of course, my daughter also, we had not coached her on what to say. I thought she was going to sit in the back and just listen. But she got up and told the man that she had no bitterness in his heart and she forgave him. And the next morning, that was on the front lines in the Arabic papers that 10-year-old had forgiven the assailant.
What an incredible witness. As we begin to close our time here, Ray, I again just want to say the experience that Dan and I had in Ethiopia, and then Marianne Osborne, actually from World Vision, gave me the book Dangerous Love, and the witness that your family has displayed has been incredible. I would imagine a lot of our listeners are like, okay, Christians, believers are going to have to wrestle with the message of the Good Samaritan in light of something like this. But thankfully, I guess, most of our listeners won't experience, a shooting by someone from another faith of a child. So with that being said, what is the message of Dangerous Love that you would sort of like to give to, I hate to say everyday believers, but you get my point, right? What's the key takeaway for Western Christians, if you will, from the message of Dangerous Love?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, right after 9/11, I was profoundly disturbed by the rhetoric of hate and fear that I heard from the church right after 9/11. There was a lot of negative rhetoric about Muslims. And most Muslims are not radicals or fanatics. Most Muslims are people like you and me who love their wives and children and families, and are seekers of the truth. They may have not discovered that, but they're just good humans like you and me. And so I was very disturbed about that. And I certainly think that as Christians, we need to be defenders of the truth, as we find in Scripture. But I think where we fail is if we're going to be imitators of Jesus, we not only have to be defenders of truth, but we have to learn to walk in love. And I think our the feeling of being threatened or afraid and being insecure in times like this, with the differences and the conflicts between Muslim countries and Western countries, we fail to walk in love among these people. So that was the main reason that I was compelled to write the story in Dangerous Love. And we wrestle with the limits of our own love. It's not easy to love unlovely people. And some Muslims are not very lovely, just like some of us here in America are not very lovely.
Yeah.
But what we have to do is understand Christ's love for all people.
Yeah.
It's not the issue of wrestling with the limits of our own love, because that's going to fail us. But I'll always remember when I started working among Muslim people, all of a sudden it was like a curtain would be pulled back, and I would get this brief sense, this glimpse of Christ's love for these people that were before me. And it was like getting my hands on a live wire. And I think we need, as Christians, the church needs to encounter Christ's love for all people if, in fact, we're going to reach the world in his name. And that's why I put the book together.
Well, that's good. Well, I think I mentioned this to my staff. I think it's in 1 John chapter 3. There's the scripture that says the yardstick of love is Christ's willingness to die for us. And if that's the measurement, if that's the yardstick, is Christ's willingness to die on a cross for us, let that be our benchmark, right? Let that be the standard against which we love other people. And I love the way you've talked about that in the context of your book.
So Ray, you're not in Mauritania anymore. Now you're hanging out in Pennsylvania. Why don't you tell us what you're up to these days?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I lead our global WASH sector work across the globe for World Vision. I work because I travel so much. Before COVID, the last several years, I've traveled about 35% of my time. So when I'm home, I work from my home rather than in one of World Vision's offices. So I am based here. So actually, the COVID-19 crisis, the silver lining on the cloud is I've been home more than I've been in 5 years. So that's been a nice aspect of it. We're in Pennsylvania because I used to work at Messiah College, which is right here down the street, and I still serve as a scholar in residence. But I am now full-time with World Vision, and as I mentioned, my wife is French, so we're often in France. She has elderly parents, so we spend a fair amount of our year in France as well, based out of there. So for me, home is wherever my wife is. If she's in PA or she's in France, I just go home there and work from there.
I wonder if we could trade Auburn tickets for a trip to France, Danny. What do you think?
Yes, we could.
That's a no-brainer for me, man.
Well, Ray, as we wrap up, I want to thank you for your story and for your testimony, really. I mean, what an incredible journey that you and your family have experienced. Could you maybe tell our listeners, if you want to learn more about WASH, if you want to learn more about World Vision, if you want to get your hands on Dangerous Love, tell them how they can connect with you and your mission.
Well, if you want to get your hands on Dangerous Love, you can just Google it. It's available on Amazon.com or any of the other book sources. It's quite easy to find. If you just Google Dangerous Love, you'll find it online. As far as connecting with WASH and World Vision's work, I think the easiest way, again, is just Google World Vision and clean water. Let me say that again, World Vision and Clean Water, and it'll take you to our website where there's information on various aspects of the program, resources to learn more, newsletters and various forums that you can join, and, of course, various ways to give. And it provides an excellent, that website provides an excellent introduction to our programs.
Terrific. Well, Ray, in closing, Dan and I just want to thank you for being here and for talking a little bit more about WASH, about the Interfaith Councils, about your Christian witness in light of tragedy shortly after 9/11. Would you mind just maybe one final message to our listeners about what you think it means to be a good neighbor in light of go and do likewise after Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for letting me have this opportunity to share and talk with you. I really appreciate your theme taken from the parable of the Good Samaritan. And by the way, if you go to Samaria today, Samaria is now Jacob's Well, in fact, is in the town of Sychar, which is actually essentially an all-Muslim town today. So I have no doubt that if Jesus was walking off the map, and of course going through Samaria was walking off the map in his day, at the well he would have encountered a Muslim woman.
Yeah.
And I think if he was telling the story of the Good Samaritan, it would have probably been the Good Muslim.
Yeah. There you go.
Today, if he was telling it. So, Jesus really walked off the map going to Samaria. And let me just close with kind of that analogy of a map. Maps are these places that reveal places that other people have been before us, where someone else has been. And the old maps of the old world, the areas that were yet undiscovered couldn't be mapped. And so the cartographers fill those areas with pictures of sea monsters and dragons, implying that you don't want to go there. No one else has been there, so don't go there. And let me switch over quickly. C.S. Lewis called theology, he referred to theology like a map. He said good theology is really a summary of people's understanding of the Christian faith. He said, however, good theology doesn't replace a personal relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
And he said, you got to get off the map to encounter that relationship. And I think it's the same way in the church today. If we're going to reach the world, we've got to walk off the map. We've got to go out there where the dragons and the sea monsters lurk if we're going to engage this world. And it means, we have to get out of our safe zones. We have to be stretched. We have to reach across these cultures and reach across these religious divides without fear, without being threatened, without feeling insecure, and really engage this world not only as defenders of truth, but as a people who love with the love of Christ.
I love it. Walk off the map, Dan. Yeah. Well, Dr. Norman, this has been an absolute treat and a pleasure, and I want to thank you on behalf of Giving Company, on behalf of our listeners, for spending time with us, and even more so, your witness is just incredibly impactful.
Thank you so much for sharing, man.
Thank you. What a blessing to be with you.
Dan, this is our second podcast in a row of an Auburn person that I feel good.
And they're hitting home runs.
That's right. So, well, that's it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in with Dan Riveros and I on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This has been just a rich time with special guest Dr. Ray Norman from World Vision. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thanks, guys. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.